Now, there are some cases where you can use the memo function and the useMemo hook together, and let me show you one example. So let's say that we want to pass one more prop to this memo example, and let's say we want to pass this cards prop. So I'm going to pass cards equal to cards. Now cards here is an array which is of the object type. Now because this is of the object type, then you need to be cautious, and I'm going to explain why. So let's say memo example, we have cards here. Let's just say we do something with cards. I'm not going to do anything with cards in this example. Let's go back to app.jsx, and let's say the only state that we are changing is show use effect comp. Now, as we have already understood, if we are only changing this state, then our component should not re-render because that state has no business with this component. But let's see what happens. So the first time memo example is rendered, we have this. Now when I click on update states would change the show use effect comp states from true to false. But as you can see here, we have another log which shows that this component was re-rendered again. But why was it re-rendered? We changed a state that has nothing to do with the show pricing cards prop. It has nothing to do with the show heading prop. It has nothing to do with the cards prop. So why is this component being re-rendered even after we have used the memo function? Now the reason for this is the memo function applies a shallow equality check before it does a re-render, and shallow equality works perfectly fine for primitive values like your boolean. So currently we're using boolean for the show pricing cards, boolean for the show heading, which is fine. It would also work fine for numbers, it would work fine for strings, but it wouldn't work fine for objects. In our case, we have an array which is of the object type, and maybe you already know the reason for this because we have looked at it in previous lessons, but let me explain. Remember that when state of a component changes, everything in that component is recreated again. So that means that this function would be recreated again, and that also means that this object would be recreated again. And as we have come to understand in JavaScript, two objects, even if they have the same contents, the same structure, they are not equal. And that's the same thing with arrays. So even if you have two empty arrays, they are not equal. Even if you have an array that has maybe one value Deeecode, and this second array also has one value Deeecode, they look the same, but they are not exactly equal. And this is because of references. So far we have come to see that with objects, because these two objects have different references, even if they have the same data, the references are not equal. And same thing with the array. This array has a different reference than this array, so it is not equal. I have a lesson where I dive deeper into why objects like these are not equal. I'll link it in the video description below. You can check it out if you want to know more detail on this. So what this means now is that the first time the app component is rendered, this cards array is going to have one reference. Now when state changes, in this case we change the show use effect comp state, it means that this cards array would be created again with a new reference. So the previous reference of this array is not equal to the current reference of this array, and that is why this component is re-rendered, because what the memo function would see is that the memo function would see that the cards array from the previous render is not equal to the cards array on the current render. And what would the memo function do when a prop value changes? If the value of a prop changes, then that component will be rendered again. So even if the previous cards array has the same data as the current cards array, because they have different references, the memo function would then conclude that this prop has changed. So this prop did not change, it remained true, that's fine. This prop did not change, it also remained true, that's fine. But this prop changed because the reference changed, and so the component will be re-rendered. So then how can you avoid this? How can you ensure that this component is only re-rendered when the content of this array changes and not the reference? Well, one way you can fix this is to take this cards array from inside of the component to outside the component. So when it is outside the component, it means that even if this component is re-rendered, this array would not be created again. So in that way, it would have the same reference all the time. So let's check this out. So I refresh, the memo example component is rendered the first time. Now when I click on update states, and update states would change this to false. So if it changes it to false, you can see we no longer have that component below. You can see that the memo example component is not rendered again, because this component's re-rendering is not creating this array again, then you ensure that you always have the same reference. And when you have the same reference, then the memo function can say this did not change, this did not change, this reference did not change. There is no need to run this component again. Now this is one way, but sometimes you may want to have this cards array in the component itself. Let's say for this cards array, maybe you have another state that says selected, so that you know the selected card. So we're going to say use state, and currently selected is null. Let's say we have something like this. I'm not going to write the code for this, but let's say you have a function that when the function is called, it will set selected to the right card. Then in these cards now, you can say you have a selected property where you can now say if the currently selected state is equal to startup. So we have something like this, and we have it also for this second card, and we have it also for this third card. So here we can say if this is pro, and here we can say if this is enterprise. So let's say you have something like this. Let's even say that by default this is. So what we are doing here now is we are building this cards array with this selected state. If we had this cards array outside this function, we will not have access to this selected state. But because we need access to this selected state, we now need to create this cards array in the component. As we already understand, this component will be rendered every time the state changes in this app component, because this reference always changes. Now this is where we can use useMemo. As we saw, useMemo allows us to memoize a value and only recompute that value if we need to. So here we can say useMemo. I need to also import this from React. And as we saw previously, the syntax from useMemo, it takes a callback function and then it has dependencies. Now the dependencies for this cards array is going to be selected, which means we only want to compute the cards array when the selected state changes. If the selected state doesn't change, then we want to keep using the memoized value of the cards array. Now in this function, we can now return this. I'm going to have return, and then we have this array returned. So by using useMemo, we are now able to create a memoized version of this cards array, and that memoized version would only be recomputed when the selected state changes. Now if I open the console, we have a new error here, and that is because we are passing a key selected, which we do not expect in our pricing card. So if I go to pricing card, this is where prop types can be useful. So in our pricing card, we specify that this should be the structure of a card. But now that we have introduced a new property selected, we now have a warning. So here I can just add selected. Prop types boolean is required. And we also need to come to pricing cards and go to our prop types and also say that we are expecting a selected prop of boolean. Now if I should refresh, okay, we have fixed the prop type, so now we know that our types are in check. So now we have this, and now if I should click on update state, remember update state is going to update the show use effect comp. So if I click on update states, show use effect comp becomes false, so the component is not rendered below. But you can see that memo example is not re-rendered. That's why we do not have another log. It is not re-rendered because we created a memoized version of our array, and that memoized version is only renewed when our dependency changes. Our dependency is selected. So as long as selected doesn't change, then we would keep using that memoized value for the cards array, and that way the reference would always stay the same for cards, and we would not need to re-render memo example. So the only time we would need to re-render memo example is number one, if the selected state changes. If it changes, that means we're going to have a new reference for the cards. That's one. It will also be rendered if show heading changes or if show pricing cards changes. As long as these three doesn't change and we have our memo function here, then we would keep using the memoized version of that component, and this will help us avoid many re-renders that can affect the performance of our application. Now we only re-render this component when we need to re-render the component. If we don't need to re-render the component, then we just use the memoized version. So I hope this example also shows you how you can use the memo function together with the useMemo hook. Now, does this mean you should use the memo function everywhere in your application? No. If your component is a very simple component, then it doesn't hurt to always remember that component. It's not going to affect the performance of your application. But if your component is a big one doing maybe expensive stuff, then you want to avoid unnecessary re-render. And also, there are many optimization techniques for your React applications. The memo function is one of them, useMemo hook is another, but there are several other techniques which we'll be looking at as we continue in this course. I hope you enjoyed this one and the memo function now makes more sense to you. Please give this video a like, share with others, and also subscribe so that you are notified when a new lesson is published.